Yeah, I think before we talk about who John Brown was, I'd like to talk about who he wasn't, and just to be very succinct about it. John Brown wasn't a terrorist. He was labeled as a terrorist, but historically speaking, he was a counter-terrorist. He did use violence, but he used violence really in self-defense and also to subvert terrorist violence, widespread terrorist violence taking place in the Kansas territory. Otherwise, he never used violence unless he was in combat. So he wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't a ne'er-do-well. He's often portrayed as a guy who failed so miserably in life, so miserably in business, that the only thing left for him to do was to try to become an abolitionist. But that's simply nonsensical. He was, from the very beginning, wanted to be an abolitionist tycoon. He wanted to actually be a rich man in business to use all his resources to end slavery. That didn't work out for him. But it was really the circumstances of history that drove him more to active abolitionism. In his life, he did have business downturns. Jackson had destroyed the National Bank. There wasn't a uniform economic situation in that part of the century. And there were not modern day economic safety nets like limited liability corporations. There was a crash that hit the East Coast. And by the time it reached the western states, which in those days would have been Ohio, Illinois, by then John Brown and a lot of people were doing business in credit. And this is what ruined him. It was that the banks, couldn't deliver, and so he failed. Historians have acted as if John Brown was the only one who failed in business and he was just miserably a failure. The truth is that he'd recovered, and by the late 1840s, he was very sought after as a specialist in fine sheep and wool. He built a reputation for himself so that he could travel around the Northeast, I think as far down as in Virginia, and he could even write certificates of quality regarding flocks of sheep. He was even considered one of the three foremost judges of the quality of fine sheep and wool. So this idea that he was a ne'er-do-well is a lie of historians who just pick around the edges of his story and tell the same nonsense over and over again. So he wasn't a terrorist, he wasn't a ne'er-do-well, and he wasn't crazy. Throughout his whole life, there was never any suggestion that he had insanity. His family thought it was nonsensical. And we know the origin of the crazy story in the 19th century was during his incarceration, that his friends, especially and some relatives, began to prepare affidavits with the intention of trying to get his death sentence commuted. But in the middle of the 20th century, the Lincoln historians, who were hostile to Brown, as well as Civil War historians who know next to nothing about John Brown, and who essentially were status quo lost cause people who were protecting the integrity of the South, they all ganged up on John Brown, and the insanity issue was one of the favorite points of attack in the middle of the 20th century. That's been pretty much set aside. We know now that there's just no substance to it, and yet there are still plenty of people, because it's trickled down into the broad culture, particularly among white people, who will continually talk about John Brown being crazy.